I will give you 30 days to prove your worth. After the sand runs out.
On the morning of her wedding, Evelyn Hartwell learned that she had exactly 30 days to remain the Duchess of Ashbourne. The words were spoken so calmly that for a heartbeat, the chapel seemed unable to understand its own cruelty. Sunlight spilled through the stained glass windows and scattered crimson and gold across the marble floor. White lilies trembled in tall silver vases. The priest had only just closed his prayer book. Duke Nathaniel Ashbourne and Lady Evelyn Hartwell had been husband and wife for less than a minute. When the Dowager Duchess rose from the front pew, Lady Augusta Ashbourne was nearly 70, dressed entirely in black silk despite the wedding, and still possessed the kind of authority that made old men straighten their backs and young women lower their eyes. In both hands, she carried an antique silver hourglass. Its frame was engraved with the Ashbourne crest, its glass clouded faintly with age, and inside it rested pale golden sand that gleamed like powdered sunlight. She placed it on the altar between the bride and groom. 4 centuries, every duchess of this house has faced it. Every worthy woman has endured it. Evelyn felt the attention of the chapel settle on her like a weight. Lady Augusta turned the hourglass. The first grains began to fall. 30 days, she continued. If before the final grain falls, Lady Evelyn has failed to prove herself worthy of Ashbourne, the family council shall recommend that this marriage be dissolved before it becomes a permanent stain upon our bloodline. A murmur moved through the guests. Some looked shocked. Others looked merely entertained. Evelyn realized then that the humiliation had been prepared long before she reached the altar. The hourglass had been polished. The witnesses had been invited not to celebrate her marriage but to watch the first wound of it. Beside her Nathaniel went still. "Grandmother," he said. His voice remained controlled but the warning inside it was clear. Lady Augusta did not even blink. "It is tradition." "No," Nathaniel replied. "It is cruelty." A thin impatience sharpened the old woman's face. 3 better brides rejected this marriage before Lady Evelyn accepted it. Ashbourne has already suffered enough embarrassment. Surely the family has earned the right to know whether its newest duchess intends to strengthen this house or become another mistake. The words struck the chapel harder than any slap. Evelyn knew what everyone was thinking. The daughters of richer houses had refused Nathaniel. Families with more influence had stepped away from Ashbourne. Only after those refusals had Evelyn's uncle accepted the proposal on her behalf, because poverty made obedience easier to purchase. Nathaniel had not chosen her. She had simply been the woman who remained. "Do you object, child?" For a moment Evelyn imagined what they expected from her. A lowered gaze. A promise to behave well enough to be kept. But there were moments when humiliation demanded tears only because it feared silence. And Evelyn refused to diminish herself for a family already so eager to judge her. She met Lady Augusta's eyes. "If Ashbourne requires 30 days to discover my worth," she said evenly, "then I shall not waste a single one begging for it." The chapel fell silent. The silence of recalculation. Lady Augusta studied her for several seconds, then smiled as if she had just been offered a more interesting game. So be it. The wedding breakfast that followed was a masterpiece of polished silver and poisoned manners. Ashbourne Castle glittered beneath chandeliers, but no warmth seemed to survive there for long. Servants moved with perfect discipline. Evelyn sat beside Nathaniel at the high table, aware of the hourglass now placed not far from her plate. Its falling sand more closely watched than the bride herself. Lord Malcolm Ashbourne, Nathaniel's cousin, raised his wineglass toward her. He was blandly handsome and too charming in the way of men who had never been punished for cruelty so long as they delivered it gracefully. "So brave of you, Duchess," he said. Not every lady would accept such a challenge on her wedding day. Evelyn smiled politely. Not every family would issue one. A spoon struck a plate too sharply somewhere down the table. Nathaniel lowered his eyes, but not before Evelyn caught the briefest hint of amusement crossing his face. Malcolm's smile thinned. "I only meant that Ashbourne is no small household to manage." "I should hope not," Evelyn replied. "It would be disappointing to be tested by something small." This time Nathaniel looked at her properly. No smile. No warmth that she could safely trust. But something had changed in his eyes, a small shift from apology into attention. By late afternoon, Evelyn was taken to the Duchess's apartments in the East Wing. The rooms were grand, elegant, and impersonal, as though no woman had ever been allowed to live there long enough to leave a trace of herself. Her belongings looked almost pitiful once unpacked: a few dresses, several books, her mother's sewing box, and a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. On the marble mantel, someone had already placed the hourglass where she would be forced to see it every time she entered. Nathaniel came to her just before sunset. He stopped at the threshold instead of walking in, as though the room belonged to her more completely than the marriage did. "I owe you an apology," he said. Evelyn turned from the window. "For the hourglass? For all of it? That is generous. You did not put it on the altar." "No, but I knew my grandmother opposed this marriage, and I underestimated the lengths to which she would go." Evelyn studied him. In the gentler light of evening, he looked less severe than he had in the chapel. His dark hair had come slightly loose from its formal arrangement, and there was a weariness in his face that no title could hide. "Why did you marry me?" she asked. The question was too direct to be graceful, but the day had already made ceremony feel absurd. Nathaniel did not answer immediately. "Ashbourne has been losing influence for years. My grandmother wanted a marriage that would restore power to the house, but the families she approached refused. Your uncle was willing. My uncle is willing whenever someone else pays the..." A faint, unwilling softness touched Nathaniel's mouth. "Yes, I gathered as much. And your family agreed because they believed I would be quiet." His silence was answer enough. Evelyn almost laughed. How disappointing for everyone. This time Nathaniel did smile briefly before guilt took it away. "I can arrange for you to leave Ashbourne until this matter is settled," he said. "You do not have to remain here and endure their judgment." "You mean hide me?" "There is very little difference when spoken by a man who has already married me." The truth of that landed between them. Nathaniel looked toward the hourglass. "I did not choose this." "No," Evelyn said. "But you were raised by people who did." His face tightened, not in anger but recognition. She stepped toward the mantel and watched the golden sand fall in its narrow stream. "I will not leave, Your Grace. Your grandmother gave me 30 days. I intend to use them." Evelyn touched the silver frame lightly. It was cold beneath her fingers, older than the room, older than the woman who had used it. "It has a weapon. To discover why this family is so afraid I might have." Nathaniel looked at her, then truly looked, and for the first time since the wedding, Evelyn saw uncertainty disturb his careful control. After he had gone, Evelyn remained beside the mantel, watching the golden sand slip through the narrow throat of the glass. There was something unsettling about the object, though at first she could not name it. It was not simply the arrogance of placing it in her chamber like a sentence waiting to be carried out. It was the weight of it, the age of the silver frame, the careful engravings almost hidden beneath years of polishing. When she lifted it into the fading light, she noticed a line of lettering so faint it seemed less carved than whispered into the metal. "Not all sand falls downward." Evelyn frowned. An hourglass had only one purpose, unless someone had designed this one to do more than measure time. She turned the base slowly, feeling along the rim until her fingernail caught on a seam too fine to be accidental. A soft metallic sound answered from inside the frame. Not glass. Something hidden. Carefully, she twisted the silver base. A narrow compartment opened beneath her thumb, and inside it lay a tiny iron key. No longer than the first joint of her finger. For several moments, Evelyn simply stared at it, feeling the shape of the day change around her. Lady Augusta believed she had placed an ancient judgment in Evelyn's chamber, a reminder that every grain of sand was carrying her closer to rejection. But someone long before Evelyn had hidden a different message inside that same cruel tradition. The hourglass was not only a test, it was a warning. And perhaps if Evelyn was brave enough to follow it, a weapon. By the third day of her marriage, Evelyn Hartwell had learned that Ashbourne Castle was a house built not only of stone but of silence. People did not lie openly there. Instead, they lowered their voices when certain portraits were mentioned. They changed subjects when Evelyn asked about old traditions. They smiled whenever Lady Augusta entered the room, then spoke no more than necessary until she left. Even the servants moved as if the walls had ears, and perhaps they did. For Ashbourne seemed to collect secrets the way other houses collected dust. Evelyn kept the tiny iron key hidden in the lining of her sewing box. She did not tell Nathaniel at once. Not because she distrusted him entirely, but because trust, like suspicion, needed evidence. He had apologized for the hourglass. He had defended her before his grandmother. He had even looked at her as if she were not quite the quiet, convenient wife his family had expected. But he was still an Ashbourne, raised inside the very silence she was trying to understand. So Evelyn began alone. The key fit nothing obvious. Not the jewel cabinet in her dressing room. Not the old writing desk. Not the locked drawer beneath the mantel. She tried it in the chapel chest when no one was watching, in the library case where old estate books were kept, and in a small rosewood box filled only with dried petals and broken hairpins. Nothing opened. On the 6th day she found the portrait. It hung in a narrow passage near the abandoned nursery, a place where the air smelled faintly of lavender and old rain. The woman in the painting was young, dark-haired, and unsmiling, dressed in silver blue silk with one hand resting upon an hourglass. Her eyes were what stopped Evelyn. They did not look weak, though the servants had described her that way when Evelyn asked. Carefully at supper. Duchess Rosamond Ashbourne, they had said, was a poor fragile creature who failed the 30-day trial and brought shame upon the house. Evelyn looked at the painted woman and thought no. That was not fragility in Rosamond's eyes. That was warning. The frame sat slightly away from the wall. Evelyn touched the side of it, felt a draft, and carefully drew the portrait forward. Behind it was a small iron door, nearly invisible against the dark paneling. The key from the hourglass turned once. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Evelyn carried them back to her room beneath her shawl and read until dawn. Rosamond had not failed Ashbourne. She had discovered it. Her letters described false debts, forged contracts, land rents vanishing into private accounts, and a cousin who expected to take control of the estate if Rosamond's husband died without an heir. The 30-day trial had not been an ancient tradition then. It had been invented to make Rosamond seem unstable and unworthy before she could expose the theft. On the last page, written in a hand that had grown unsteady but not afraid, Rosamond left a warning for any woman clever enough to find it. If another duchess is ever given 30 days, it means they are afraid she has begun to see. Evelyn sat very still as the morning light crept across the floor. Then she gathered the letters and went to Nathaniel. She found him in the estate office surrounded by ledgers and unopened correspondence. His coat had been discarded over the back of a chair, his cravat loosened. And for the first time, he looked less like the master of Ashbourne than a man trying to hold up a crumbling house with tired hands. "You should sleep," Evelyn said from the doorway. Nathaniel looked up. That is a dangerous thing to say to a man whose wife has 24 days left to prove her usefulness. "I am not here to be useful. No. I am here to be inconvenient." Despite himself, his expression softened. Then she placed Rosamond's letters on the desk. The softness disappeared. Nathaniel read the first letter standing. He read the second sitting down. By the time he reached the final page, the color had gone from his face. When he looked up, there was anger in him, but beneath it something far more painful. "My father told me Rosamond was unstable," he said. "Fragile women do not hide evidence behind portraits. My grandmother would have known. Yes. And Malcolm. The names in Rosamond's letters are old," Evelyn said, "but the pattern is not. I saw Mr. Vale carrying ledgers yesterday with estate seals that should have been in your archive, not in a solicitor's private satchel." Nathaniel rose and went to the window. For a while he said nothing. Evelyn watched his reflection in the glass. She had expected anger, perhaps denial. "I let them place that hourglass before you," he said. "You challenged it. After it had already humiliated you." "Yes." He turned back. "You should hate me for that." "I considered it," Evelyn replied. His expression shifted, surprised despite himself. "But hate is exhausting," she continued, gathering the letters back into order, "and I have only 24 days left." A quiet sound escaped him, almost a laugh, almost a breath. Then his face grew serious. "What do you need?" The question changed the room. "Not leave this to me." Not you have done enough. What do you need? For the first time since her wedding day, Evelyn felt the beginning of an alliance. I need access to the oldest estate ledgers, she said. I need I need someone among the servants who is loyal to you rather than your grandmother. And most of all, I need you to continue behaving as though you still doubt me. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. Why? Because if they believe you trust me, they will hide everything. If they believe I am still alone, they will grow careless. And Malcolm? Evelyn glanced toward the hourglass visible through the open door of her sitting room beyond the corridor. Let him believe the sand is still judging me. For the next 2 weeks, their marriage became a performance staged for an audience too arrogant to suspect it was being fooled. At breakfast, Nathaniel addressed Evelyn with cool courtesy and no visible warmth. Lady Augusta watched with satisfaction. Malcolm grew bolder, offering false sympathy and sharper jokes. Mr. Vale stopped locking his satchel when servants entered the room. And Lady Augusta allowed herself the calm of a woman who believed the ending had already been written. But beneath that silence, Ashbourne began to move. Nathaniel's steward copied ledgers from the old archive. A maid named Elise listened outside the solicitor's room while polishing the hallway lamps. Evelyn spent afternoons pretending to write letters while comparing numbers Rosamond had recorded decades earlier with the accounts Mr. Vale was preparing now. The shape of the lie emerged slowly, then all at once. Ashbourne was not collapsing because Nathaniel had failed. It was being drained. Land rights from the eastern farms had been sold through false contracts. Payments had been hidden in trusts connected to Malcolm's name. Vale was preparing a petition that would first remove Evelyn as an unsuitable duchess. Then question Nathaniel's judgment for marrying her. Once Nathaniel's authority was weakened, Malcolm would become acting guardian of the estate. Lady Augusta would rule through him. Mr. Vale would legalize the theft. And Evelyn, the poor bride given 30 days to prove her worth, would be remembered as one more unworthy woman who had failed Ashbourne. On the 29th evening, Lady Augusta summoned the family council to the great hall. The hourglass was placed at the center of the long table. Only a thin stream of sand remained in the upper glass. Malcolm smiled when Evelyn entered, beautiful and cruel in the candlelight. I hope you have enjoyed your month as Duchess, he said. Evelyn looked at the falling sand, then at the men and women waiting to watch her disappear. Oh, I have, she answered quietly. It has been most educational. They had given her 30 days to prove her worth. They did not know she had spent them measuring the size of their lie. The great hall of Ashbourne Castle had witnessed generations of triumphs disguised as duty, and failures disguised as tradition, but on the 30th day of Evelyn Hartwell's marriage, the room carried a different kind of silence. It was the silence that settled over people who believed they already knew the ending. Around the long oak table sat the senior members of the Ashbourne family, while servants stood quietly against the walls, pretending not to listen even. Though every pair of eyes drifted toward the silver hourglass placed in the center of the table. Only a thin stream of golden sand remained in the upper chamber. Lady Augusta rose first. 30 days have passed, she announced with measured dignity. House Ashbourne has fulfilled its obligation. We have observed Lady Evelyn's conduct, her usefulness, and her ability to strengthen this family. It is now time for the council to decide whether this marriage should continue. Vale unfolded a prepared document and cleared his throat. As solicitor for House Ashbourne, I recommend that the marriage be dissolved on the grounds that the Duchess has failed to satisfy the long-standing expectations of this house. Before another word could be read, Evelyn spoke, her voice calm enough that it carried effortlessly. Across the hall. I should like to understand those expectations before they are used to judge me. The solicitor looked up, mildly irritated. They are the traditions of Ashbourne. I understand that, Evelyn replied with a courteous smile. What I wish to know is where those traditions are written. A faint murmur passed around the table. Mr. Vale hesitated. They have always been understood. By whom? Then this family should have no difficulty showing me the document that grants you the authority to end a lawful marriage. For the first time that morning, uncertainty crossed more than one face. Lady Augusta answered before the solicitor could. Not every tradition requires ink. No, Evelyn said quietly, Only the ones people hope will survive questions. Malcolm leaned back in his chair and laughed. You are remarkably confident for someone who has already lost. Evelyn turned toward him. Am I? I had the impression this meeting was meant to discover the truth. If the decision was made before I entered the room, then perhaps it is not my worth that is being examined after all. Nathaniel had remained silent until then, allowing the conversation to unfold exactly as Evelyn had asked. But when Mr. Vale reached again for the petition, the Duke rose from his chair with slow, deliberate composure. I believe my wife deserves an answer. The room fell still. Lady Augusta looked at her grandson as though she scarcely recognized him. Nathaniel. He met her eyes without lowering his own. Before anyone decides her future, I would like someone to explain by what authority this council believes it can erase vows spoken before God. No one answered. Evelyn reached into the leather portfolio she had carried into the hall, and placed a bundle of faded letters upon the polished table. I can answer that instead. The blue ribbon around the letters had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. These belonged to Duchess Rosamond Ashbourne. Lady Augusta's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Nathaniel laid several estate ledgers beside the letters, and together they transformed the atmosphere of the room. What had begun as a family judgment suddenly resembled an investigation. Rosamond was not a weak woman, Evelyn continued. She discovered that money from the estate was disappearing through false contracts. Before she could expose those responsible, she was declared unstable and the 30-day trial was used to destroy her reputation. She opened the final letter and read aloud. If another duchess is ever given 30 days, it means they are afraid she has begun to see. The words lingered in the hall like a bell that refused to stop ringing. Nathaniel opened one of the ledgers. The accounts described in these letters did not end with Rosamond, he said. They continued. He turned the pages slowly so everyone at the table could see. Payments from the Eastern farms disappeared into private trusts. Those trusts were later transferred under Lord Malcolm's authority. Malcolm rose abruptly. This is absurd. It would be, Nathaniel replied calmly, if your signature did not appear on every transfer. Colour drained from Malcolm's face. Mr. Vale attempted to interrupt, but Evelyn spoke before he could. For 30 days I believed the hourglass was meant to. I was mistaken. It was meant to distract every duchess long enough for someone else to continue stealing from Ashbourne. She walked toward the silver hourglass standing in the center of the table and rested one hand upon its worn. My husband asked me what I intended to do with these 30 days. The answer was never to prove I deserved this family. Her fingers found the hidden seam beneath the base. It was to discover whether this family deserved my loyalty. A soft metallic click echoed through the hall. The concealed compartment slid open. From within, Evelyn withdrew the folded declaration Rosamond had hidden decades before. Nathaniel accepted it with steady hands. As his eyes moved across the page, the silence around him deepened. It bears my great-grandfather's seal, he said quietly. Rosamond recorded everything before witnesses. She states clearly that the 30-day trial was invented to conceal fraud within the estate, and that no future duchess could ever be subjected to it without her own consent. He looked toward Lady Augusta, disappointment replacing anger. You knew. The old woman's shoulders seemed to sink beneath the weight of years she could no longer command. I did what I believed was necessary to protect Ashbourne. Nathaniel shook his head slowly. No. You protected the lie. The family council dissolved almost without argument. The evidence was too complete, the pattern too clear. Mr. Vale surrendered the estate records for formal investigation while Malcolm's protests grew quieter, with every document placed before him. For the first time in decades, the Ashbourne name would be defended not by silence but by truth. Later that evening, Nathaniel found Evelyn alone in the winter garden where bare flowerbeds waited patiently beneath the cold sky. I once believed tradition deserved obedience simply because it had survived, he said, stopping beside her. You taught me that traditions survive for many reasons, and not all of them are honorable. Evelyn smiled gently as she emptied the last grains of golden sand from the hourglass into the dark soil below. Then let something better grow here. Nathaniel covered her hand with his. When spring finally reached Ashbourne, white lilies bloomed where the sand had fallen. And people would later say that Duchess Evelyn had saved the estate in only 30 days. But those who knew the whole story understood the truth. She had never been taking a test. She had simply been brave enough to ask the one question no Ashbourne had dared to ask before her. Every great love begins with a choice. Evelyn chose truth over fear. Nathaniel chose love over silence. If this story moved you, please leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below.